Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Moghaddam. You have given us a lot of things to think about. That was a really excellent presentation. I believe that Dr. Moghaddam is with us today, right now.
Yes,
Let
I'm
me
here.
see. Yeah, hello. What a wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed it. And we also, have several questions for you. Just in terms of structuring the rest of the session, we have a lot of time for discussion. According to my clock, it's now 10:18. We have until 10:55, and if we have time, maybe we can also talk a little bit about your next book. So I myself have a lot of questions, and there's been a very active chat that's been going on while you were presenting. So one of the questions is about whether there's any differences between the left and the right-wing authoritarianism, or do they sort of borrow from each other's playbook?
That's an excellent question. The research on the personality of authoritarianism has been spearheaded in the last 30 years or 40 years or so by Bob Altmaier, who's a Canadian researcher. I got to know his work when I used to work at McGill University in Canada. And Bob Altmaier labels his measure of authoritarianism as a right-wing authoritarianism. And there are a number of psychologists who agree with Bob Altmaier that authoritarianism is really right-wing. But it seems to me, if we look at the consequences of authoritarianism, look at the situation from the perspective of the victim. It seems to me, if you are a victim in Stalin's Soviet Union, or if you're a victim in Hitler's Nazi Germany, the consequences for you are very similar. If you're a victim in the Islamic Republic, if you're a victim in North Korea or Russia or China, it seems to me that the outcome is terrible for victims. Sure, the ideology espoused by the authoritarian leader is different in China, is different in Russia, is different in Iran, is different in North Korea, but the consequences for victims are very similar. And I would argue that if you look at the personality of the authoritarian leader, the basic characteristics of the authoritarian leader is the same in these different regimes. To give you one example of the kinds of characteristics I'm talking about, if you look at, for example, Khomeini, if you look at Putin, if you look at Stalin, Hitler, any of these leaders, including some of the contemporary leadership in Western societies, what you find is the claim that they are all knowing. They are all knowing. That's why they end up attacking scientists. That's why they end up attacking science. If they were in our meeting today, they would dismiss all of us and say they know much more about psychology than we do. That's why you have somebody like Trump coming on national TV suggesting, proposing that we inject Lysol as a way of solving COVID-19. This kind of idiotic suggestion is part of a pattern. It doesn't come out of the blue. If you go back to Stalin in the Soviet Union, he victimized some of the top geneticists of his time, he victimized them. He put them in jail. Why? Because he believed he knew more about genetics than they did. Just as if you look at these extremist radio shows, extremist networks right now, they're attacking Fauci. Why? Because they think they know better than he does. So for me, at least, there is really no difference between left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism. The dictator has a number of psychological characteristics that are consistent and persistent. And as a victim, I certainly don't see any difference between them.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Another line of discussion that's been going on in the chat is about what we can do to sort of promote democracy. And one of the things that has been the word springboard conditions has been discussed among the chat. So I'm kind of wondering, what suggestions would you have for psychologists, for us? What are the springboard conditions that you think are of most critical that we should be addressing right now?
That's a great question. I think psychologists have a very heavy duty, a heavy responsibility. We represent the science that is about human behavior. So we have a duty to take part in what's going on. So that's the first point, that psychologists cannot be neutral. They have to be engaged. A second point I would make is that we have to be critical of our own discipline. We have to be critical of our traditional approaches. One of my favorite courses to teach, perhaps it's my favorite course to teach, is general psychology. When I get 18 or 19-year-old students coming into my class, and I'm always using standard textbooks to teach this class. But I don't know if you've had a look at a standard general psychology textbook recently. You won't find any discussion that is relevant to what we're talking about. The discipline of psychology is out of touch with what we're talking about. So in terms of what can we do, well, we can criticize our own discipline and get it to engage with what we think is important. And we can do this in different ways. Practicing psychologists can do it by talking about this issue and saying, look, the way we are training the next generation of psychologists is just not adequate. It's not correct. It's not going to get them involved in the right kinds of things. Now, third, in terms of the springboard situation we're in, one of the characteristics of the springboard to dictatorship is perceptions of threats. Perceptions of threats. And of course, the potential dictator intuitively knows this. One of the things about potential dictators is that they are intuitive psychologists. They don't need to read research. They intuitively know that when they give speeches, they have to keep focusing on threats. That's why there's a focus in America on the threat of invasions from the South, why we have to build walls. why we have to protect ourselves against these invasions. That's when Trump said he wants immigrants from Norway, which is quite funny. I have people writing to me from Norway saying, why on earth would we want to come to America? We have a social support system here that's superior. So what we can do is highlight this issue of threats and talk to people about threats and educate people that when our society is highlighting threats, there are consequences. So what we can do is educate our friends, educate our students, educate our clients in every way, and to discuss these things openly. The fourth thing I think we should keep in mind is that we're talking about long-term processes. You know, when we think about democracy, it's a long-term fight. It's not a matter of 5 years or 10 years. It's a long-term fight. There have been many reversals in history from democracy, from more openness to less openness. It's happened again and again. You know, I mentioned Athens 2,500 years ago. From Athens onwards, we have many examples of societies being more open, then being taken over by different forms of dictatorship. I don't know if any of you live in the New York area and went to the Medici exhibit at the Met. They had a wonderful exhibit of the Medici and the arts they support. Well, when you look at the details of what happened, Florentine Republic had some freedoms. They actually used to have authorities, people in government being voted in by at least a small number of voters. The Medici came along and closed that. They ended that. They finished off the Florentine Republic and established their own dictatorship. Now you could say, well, Florence was never a true democracy. Well, that's true. Athens wasn't a true democracy. Athens gave the vote to free men, not women, not slaves. About 2,000 years later, we had the American Revolution. And I keep pointing this out. The American Revolution went back to Athens. It gave the vote to free men, not women, not slaves. It took another several hundred years before women got the vote. And we are now in a situation where minorities are still struggling to have the vote. If you look at the last few years, all kinds of changes have been taking place in certain states, Arizona, Texas, etc., restricting voting rights. So democracy is a struggle. It doesn't come naturally and it doesn't come easily. It doesn't come in the short term. It's a long-term struggle, and we can always go backwards, which we have been doing recently.
Thank you. The questions keep coming in. I hope to get through quite a bit of them, if not all. But here's one question. Could it be that the characteristics of the authoritarian leaders is not a set of psychological traits, but more to do with the circumstances that they face, the idea that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Excellent question. We have empirical psychological evidence that power corrupts. There have been a number of very good empirical studies that show ordinary personalities can be corrupted by power. Historical evidence also shows that power corrupts. I think of Mandela, the South African leader, and George Washington as two exceptional individuals. Why? Because at a time when they could have had power, they stepped aside. George Washington was extraordinary. He set the whole tradition of term limits. Mandela could have had absolute power in South Africa. He stepped aside. But there are not many of these individuals, and I agree that power corrupts, but I don't think that it's all contextual. I do believe that the personality of the individual also matters. Unfortunately, when I went back to Iran in '79, we did not have Mandela leading the country. If we had Mandela, we might have moved closer to an open society. We had Khomeini, and Khomeini, in terms of his characteristics, he is a categorical thinker, he is dogmatic, ethnocentric, highly focused on the idea that he is the best person to make decisions. So he had all those characteristics that I see important in dictators. If you look at Hitler, Mussolini, all these people who came through in the 1930s as dictators, they certainly had certain personality characteristics that are important. So it's the characteristics of the individual, but in context. Now, in context, the 1920s and 30s were important as a context. And here I would add that in looking back at that time in history, we tend to whitewash. We tend to simplify. Very few people realize that during the 1920s and 30s, fascism and fascist movements, such as the Nazi movement, were supported not just in Germany and not just in Italy, but they were supported in England. They were supported in the United States. Hitler had strong support in England. A lot of aristocrats in England supported Hitler. Sir Oswald Mosley was the leader of the fascist movement in England. He had strong support from the aristocracy. He had strong support from the king, who came into power briefly in England, then abdicated. The king actually went and met with Hitler. He was a supporter of Hitler. He was an embarrassment once the war started, but what I'm pointing out is that the context was pro-fascist in many ways. So Oswald Mosley used to march in London with huge numbers, and he was anti-Semitic and pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi. So the context of the time was important. By the way, Hitler also had important support from people key people in the United States. That's why the US was so late in entering that war. Very key people supported Hitler in the United States.
Thank you. We have another question here, and it has to do with social media. Political powers are trying to control social media so they can manipulate perception of threats, right? And behavior. So what can we do in this area when billions of people are actually getting their information from the social media?
Another very timely question. You know, if we look back to the optimism of 30 years ago, people were so optimistic about what the computer age would do for us and what the internet would do for us. We thought about how everybody would have access to greater and greater amounts of information. We thought about how people stuck in dictatorships would be able to have freedom of information. We thought about how the internet would equalize, and the poor in the United States and in other Western countries would now have access to education, to information. But unfortunately, that has not happened. First of all, dictatorships such as China have basically created their own internet and controlled the information that is coming in. Smaller dictatorships like Iran are trying to do the same. So there is heavy censorship in some parts of the world. That's the first thing. Second, in the West, in the United States and Europe and other Western countries, we've had a trend of echo chambers, where people are using the internet to interact with others who have the same beliefs as themselves, and they are endorsing one another's views, sometimes extremist views, sometimes extremely prejudiced views, anti-minority views, anti-women views. So these echo chambers are simply serving to reinforce radicalism. Now, this is something that was predictable from a psychological perspective. Why? Because there's a lot of psychological research showing that similarity attraction is the key in social relationships. We're attracted to others who are similar to us, who believe the same things as us, who endorse our own views. In my research, I spend several hours a week at least listening to, reading radical perspectives, radical views. And I'm always in a bad mood when I'm doing this work. You know, after 3 hours of listening to a radio show of extreme right wing or left wing or whatever it is, you know, they're spouting hatred. They're saying all these things that I disagree with, and I come out with a very bad mood. It's difficult interacting with others who disagree with us, who constantly tell us we're wrong or say things that we believe are completely wrong. So this is another role for psychologists. I believe psychologists should step in more to highlight the characteristics of these extremist echo chambers, to show what is going on. It's difficult work. It's work that is not immediately rewarding, but I think it is our role to point this out, how the electronic communication systems are in some ways working against democracy. Now, should the government step in and control? Well, I believe that's a very dangerous path. Once the government steps in, the question is, what criteria are they using? Who do they shut down? We can use some criteria. For example, it seems to me that groups that support violence should definitely be shut down or monitored very closely. Increasingly, these violent groups are homegrown. They are not from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and there's just so many questions, that we have for you. And I know it's lack of time, and maybe we can have you back, at another meeting, invite you back. It's absolutely fascinating. I do want to let people know that later today, we do have the the networking cafe at 2:15 Eastern time. And this is where people can get together and have discussions. So if people want to spend some time during that networking cafe to talk further and discuss, we can meet there. And if Dr. Moghaddam is there, maybe we can continue our discussion with him as well. The other thing is we have a few more minutes here. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about your new book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist.
Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to. This book comes out of my efforts, and I think all psychologists should be doing this, to really reevaluate what we are taught in psychology. As you know, in universities, particularly in universities, psychologists do their best to distance themselves from the arts and humanities and to position themselves as part of science. So we psychologists want to be next to chemists and biologists and physicists, not areas like English literature. And I think this is a terrible, terrible tragedy, because there is so much that we can learn from the arts and humanities. Just because I do empirical research doesn't mean that I have to distance myself from English literature. And in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, what I did was to argue that the beginnings of experimental psychology can actually be found in early modern literature. And specifically, I use the example of Shakespeare's plays. And I discuss a number of well-known Shakespeare plays, such as Hamlet. And I show how in these plays, Shakespeare has inserted psychological experiments. And I argue that Shakespeare should be considered as working in the scientific revolution that was taking place in his time. And I discuss examples of how Shakespeare was knowledgeable about the psychological revolution taking place at his time. And I discuss the concept of thought experiments. And I discuss examples of scientists such as Albert Einstein, who only did thought experiments. You know, Einstein is, for me at least, among the 2 or 3 greatest scientists ever. Did he spend his time in labs? Did he do 1-hour experiments? No. All he did was thought experiments. And over a century later, we're still trying to catch up with Einstein. His ideas were so far ahead. For example, he died, as far as I know, not knowing whether there are black holes or not, but he put forward this idea. And here we are over a century later, talking about experimenting, researching black holes. He came up with these ideas through thought experiments. And I argue in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, that Shakespeare used thought experiments in his plays. He is doing experimental psychology through thought experiments. And we psychologists should not be trying to distance ourselves from English literature. We should be interacting, we should be learning from, particularly in therapy, particularly in practice. It seems to me the narrative approach is very central. So in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, I've tried to go against the mainstream approach of distancing ourselves from the humanities and the arts.
Thank you so much. I want to let everybody know, that Dr. Moghaddam has written very widely on this topic, and he has several books, and I certainly have read his work, and I'm very, very interested. It's very fascinating, it's very informative, and it really helps me to try to understand what's happening in the world today. So I want to show you, like, for example, this is one book, okay, Threat to Democracy. And then these are the 2 I have at hand. The others are in my lab, and I'm actually streaming from home. So here you go. That's one book, okay? And there are many more. And then, of course, the latest one is Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist. So I want to remind everybody that at 2:15 today, we do have the networking cafe. And I would encourage people to turn up. And if Dr. Moghaddam has time, if he wants to drop in, we would very much welcome him so that we can just ask him more questions. So between now and 2:15, I'm sure everybody will have time to sort of ponder and reflect and come up with more questions and go, oh, I sure wish I had asked that question. Well, maybe you might have a chance at 2:15. So we are coming up to it's about 10:50, but I think maybe we can break here, give everybody a rest to, to go off and maybe have a drink or something before the next session start, which is a symposium on climate justice. And I see a chat, I think, from Mary that says, say go and gallery view. Okay, everybody go to gallery view and put on your video, if you would please. And we want to take a photograph, a screenshot with Dr. Moghaddam.
No. We want to also.
Very fascinating talk. Very fascinating. And remember, our sessions are being recorded and they will be posted on the Icp2021 website after the conference. So you can review his talk again in case you want to listen, in case you miss anything. Okay, so Mary, have you taken screenshots of us?
Yes, I have. But I also just wanted Dr. Moghaddam to see that we are here. And this was so engrossing. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye
thanks.
for now. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And I'll be in touch with you, Dr. Moghaddam. I'll
Thank you very
communicate with
much.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
So just
you.
everybody remember, take a break, but don't leave the meeting. Come back. We'll start again on the hour.